It's been a while since I've been in First Kings, but it is rich. We'll journey together. And so it reads these words. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life like the one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But he himself went on a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank, then went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." And God said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answered again, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king of Aram. Whoever escapes from the sword, Jehu shall kill, and whoever escapes, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." This is the word of God for the people of God. So this is a quite heavy and interesting and layered passage. As I said, it's been a while since I've been in First Kings, but this is one of my favorites. There's a lot happening. Elijah is one of the most fascinating prophets in the Hebrew Bible. He is recognized in Judaism, Christianity, and even in Islam. He is known for urging the people of Israel back to their God, critiquing the idols of the day, and performing many miracles. The writer of First Kings presents Elijah as a very admirable, fierce, and brave leader. Throughout his ministry, Elijah speaks boldly to Ahab and Jezebel, the corrupt leaders of the day. And he also enjoyed a very special closeness to God, like several of his ancestors before him. And for a while, things were going really great for Elijah. He lived a life that we would expect those who have good favor to live. Our story today takes place not long after some of the prophet's greatest victories. If we had read the chapter right before this one, we see examples of Elijah's powerful ministry. We read about how Elijah prayed for rain, and it came after a 7-year drought. He had seen actual fire fall from heaven. He spoke confidently to a widow in need. He had seen his enemies driven out before him, and he had just taken out 850 pagan gods in a battle in order to prove that Yahweh was the real God. It was quite an amazing triumph where he basically has all of the pagan gods and brings them to task and says, if your gods are real, then let fire appear. And nothing happened, and his God was victorious, and it's this amazing, amazing story. And all around him, hearts and minds were lifted by his good deeds and his tenacious faith. And so you would think that after all of that, Elijah would be on top of the world, praising God and jumping with joy. You'd assume that after such a display of his strength and the promise of God's power, Elijah would feel confident in his abilities and ready to take on any challenge that would dare come his way. He had the blessing of experiencing wonders that most of us will never see in our lifetime. And still, our friend has much to teach us about what challenges our greatest leaders can experience. We could imagine that after the extravagant display of God's power, Elijah expected that the entire court and even country would be converted and transformed by what he had done. But instead, in this passage, we find him quite discouraged and disappointed. In fact, things start taking a turn for the worst very quickly. When Jezebel heard all that Elijah had done, she responded in true wicked fashion. She does not say, "You're right, Elijah, I was wrong," or "the fire that came from heaven proves that Yahweh is the true God rather than Baal." She doesn't say, "Thank you for showing me the truth. I can now live enlightened and in honor of the true God." Instead, Jezebel buckles down and announces that she is quite upset and wants to have Elijah killed in 24 hours. Like many oppressors throughout Scripture and even in our own society, Jezebel would rather silence the messenger than have the status quo challenged. But for Elijah, it's like, what? This isn't how things were supposed to go. People were supposed to have their minds changed. Elijah was supposed to overthrow this wicked queen. He did everything he thought he was supposed to do, and it felt like everything was going wrong. And at this point, we see Elijah buckling under the pressure. Like his sweat begins to pour. He begins taking shallower breaths, and shivers start to ripple down his spine. He's done so much up until this point, but now is too much. He runs and runs until he can't run anymore. In a single moment, he is activated and pushed to a place of no return. But then again, is it even really just one moment that causes him to crumble? Everything he has been through is finally catching up with him. The fighting, the running, the climbing, the injustice, the grief, the pressure of having to have all the answers, the criticism, the unrealistic expectations that people place on their leaders. He begins feeling now the cumulative effects of all that his ministry has required of him. He is not only afraid of Jezebel at this point, but he is also just exhausted. The work has taken a toll on his mind, body, and spirit. He is no longer able to rely on his strength or wisdom, or even his favor with God. And so he runs away to the farthest place he could find, about 80 miles south. Just a second ago, this powerful warrior of God was on top of the world, but now he is in the wilderness, depressed, anxious, and alone. Now, he is not exactly heroic or courageous in this passage, but he is very, very human. In this passage, we find Elijah under a broom tree, believing that his ministry is over and even his life not worth living. We could consider, if we looked at his physical state, that he had just taken on a big building project at the altar. At this point, he has run for miles and miles. He must have been hungry, tired, thirsty. Not only that, but he is in such spiritual and emotional turmoil. He believed that he was alone. We know that he wasn't, but he felt like he was alone. And although he had had many victories throughout his life, he now devalues himself and perhaps even his call. The work was stressful and seemed like it was accomplishing nothing. According to enduring word of this mighty man of prayer, mighty enough to make the rain and dew stop for 3.5 years, and then mighty enough to make it start again, now prayed that he would die. We can assume that none of his friends would have known. The people of Israel most likely looked up to Elijah as someone with power, wisdom, strength. As a man of God, perhaps they viewed him with awe, honor, and admiration. Maybe they thought of him as someone who had the answers and was always aware of God's presence. A colleague of mine wrote, "I bet they saw a kick-ass prophet of the Lord who was going to bring a whole corrupt establishment crashing down." No one actually saw the pain that really stormed within him. A voice constantly whispering about his own inadequacies, the hopelessness of the situation. But from Elijah's story, we learn that even prophets experience difficulty with emotional crisis. What makes mental health challenges so tricky is that they are invisible and something that not even close loved ones are always able to pick up on. In fact, these days, experts even have coined terms like functional depression and anxiety, which I don't really like this terminology, to be honest, but it generally refers to people who are capable of hiding their distress in particular ways. While these folks may have difficult moments while they are alone, for the most part, they're able to live their lives in the ways that society expects of them. They can maintain their appearance, they can maintain a job, family, ministry, even a household. They are sometimes the people who on the outside have it all figured out and seem to be winning at life. They've got money, degrees, awards, and accolades. They're well respected and the ones that others rely on for support and guidance. But on the inside, there is often a very different story playing out. Perhaps this is what Elijah was experiencing as well. That the life of a prophet is often quite lonely, and it's hard to know if there was ever anyone who asked him if he was really okay, or if others knew the weight of what he was carrying, not only for himself, but for a whole community. But my favorite thing about this passage is God's response to Elijah. Because God does not demand an immediate recovery from Elijah. When God approached Elijah under this tree, God did not offer Elijah simple or trite answers. There is no get over it, pray harder, or read this Bible verse in the passage. There is no judgment at all. God is able to meet Elijah exactly where he is. And God first attends to Elijah's physical needs. Knowing that Elijah at this point was physically exhausted, God gave him rest under the broom tree and provided food to restore his body. I absolutely love that. This man is at his wit's end, and God gives him a nap and a snack. God's wisdom, unsurprisingly, matches what we now know in science, which is that our minds, bodies, and spirits are all connected. which means that sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is take a nap and have a snack. And then God sends Elijah on a journey, a chance to recover and perhaps reflect. The mountain that he is sent to was important. It's the place where God had spoken to Moses. It was this important reminder of all that God had done in and through God's people. Part of Elijah's healing was to be reminded of this long legacy that he was a part of, the ancestry he came from, and the ways that God was with them and protected them and did wonderful works through them. And it's also significant that God gives Elijah the space that he needed to vent. He says 2 times, "This is what I'm upset about. This is all that I've done. This is all that is not happening the way I want it to happen." And we see that God doesn't immediately try to persuade him otherwise. He doesn't say, "You silly, you're not alone. I'm here. All these people are here for you." That doesn't happen. God doesn't ask him to focus on the positive, just sort of allows him to say what he needs to say. God was not uncomfortable with the true feelings coming out of Elijah. God wasn't angry or running in the opposite direction. God allows Elijah's experience to simply be his experience, knowing that God's presence would be enough. And indeed, God's presence was enough, because God knows that even though Elijah's mind is well versed in theology, what he needed was a new encounter. And so God appears to Elijah, not in a dramatic fire or earthquakes that he had grown used to, but in a soft whisper, a soft silence that was able to penetrate through Elijah's deep loneliness and feelings of inadequacy. And I think it's wrong to think that God's presence immediately solves everything. Elijah would probably still need time. He would still need constant reminders. He would still need to take his medicine, nature, rest, time spent in worship, places to unwind, memories. But still, God knew that there was power in that closeness. Rather than correction, that was the healing needed in the moment. God was patient and was able to meet his needs in a holistic way, body, mind, and spirit. Of course, we know that the Bible is not a science book. It is not intended to teach us the complexities of depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, or psychotic disorders. Its writers rarely had detailed understandings of medical and social conditions as we know them today. The Bible answers an entirely different set of questions than we might expect it to. But it does give us insight into the journeys of some of our most respected leaders. We know that those who walked closely with God were often misunderstood and carried heavy loads. We know that they were often threatened, whether that was physical threat, emotional threat, spiritual threat. We know that often those who were working to do the right thing were often persecuted. We know that prophets like Jeremiah were nicknamed the weeping prophets because of all that they bore. Elijah's story is a reminder that nobody is exempt from distress, no matter how much money you have or power or how much spirituality you have, that we are all vulnerable, and God meets each of us exactly where we are. These days, there is a heightened awareness of mental health, and we get to hear about it very often. And there are benefits and drawbacks to visibility of something. These days, mental health challenges are more normalized. We see people like politicians and celebrities and social media influencers talking about their struggles, and it makes it normal. It makes it common. It makes it something that people are able to handle hearing about. But at the same time, visibility of these issues doesn't necessarily mean that we have adequately done what we need to do to help people who are in need. whether individually or structurally. And so I think that one of the things that is really, really important is to return to this example, this ancient example of God's response, which I think is a model for all of us, that God meets practical needs. That who would have thought our God, who is full of wisdom and power and strength, would meet this person in their desperate need, not with platitudes or a whole host of miracles, but just with the practicality of rest and restoring the body and meeting needs and understanding the complexity of human beings. And I think that God's ability to listen and bear witness to what Elijah experiences is a model for us all. There are many ways to heal from mental health. It doesn't look like the same thing for everybody. For some people, it looks like therapy. For some people, it looks like medication. For some people, it looks like other types of healing practitioners. For some people, it looks like sunshine. And for some people, it looks like going out and enjoying a night with friends. It can look like so many things, and often it's a combination of things. But the thing that I love about God is that God meets us personally and individually and knows what combination of things is appropriate for each of us in our distress. And so I am grateful that on this day we have this story, which shows us not only that we are in good company when we struggle, but also that God is the very non-judgmental presence for us to lean on. And so I'm curious now how this message is moving in you. This is your time to share.
Well, you said so much, and it's so good to hear it all. Um, and I couldn't help but think about the man who boarded the subway in New York
Yes. Mm-hmm.
recently, and he simply was was shouting a bit, I guess. And but one of the things he said, he was hungry and he had no
Yeah.
food, and he had
Ugh.
no job, and so forth. And then one of the passengers put a chokehold on him
Yeah.
and ended his life. And that is, rather than someone coming forward and maybe even giving him a sandwich
Yeah.
or just dealing with the immediacy
Mm-hmm.
of his need.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of people are feeling guilty about that. One of the reasons why protests are going on at the moment in New York, um, uh, calling for justice,
Yeah.
calling for recognition. People, homeless people, shouldn't simply be afraid of them.
Yeah.
And even if one were afraid of them, one shouldn't consider them to be enemies.
Right.
And there's so much of that going on today, where people are striking out against the vulnerable,
Yeah.
and a whole political orientation is going on around that in
Right.
some of our states here, and people are running
Yeah.
for office on the basis of fear of the vulnerable peoples in our midst. So I think that you have shared a lot of wisdom here today about this problem, which is very much with us
Yeah.
everywhere in this country and beyond this
Right.
country, and how we deal with and respond to the immediacy of people's needs is what we've got to think about, I think.
Yeah.
And God's presence enables us to do that to some extent, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for that example. I don't know if you all have heard about that story in New York City, but yeah, there's a series of protests happening right now as we speak because of what happened. And, you know, I stand with those people. I understand the frustration and the intersections of racism and classism and how they both show up, and how that frustration and misdirected emotion causes us to do very, very violent things. And it's completely awful. And I thought about that story when I was writing this. Um, and, this isn't like a blatantly political passage, although it has, if we read it correctly, political implications. How does meeting immediate needs reach even to that level of how are we providing for people who are vulnerable? So thank you, Peter, for lifting that up. Okay. All right. Thank you, Theo, for your attentiveness. Yes, Judy.
Yeah, Peter, I was thinking about that story. I had a dream the other night about that homeless man. And in the dream, a woman stood up on that train car and said, surely somebody in this car has a sandwich or a snack or something they can give this man.
Yeah.
And then the dream went away.
Mm.
But it was just a thought that that could have all been prevented
Yeah.
if somebody had shared something with that man.
Yeah.
And thank you for this story today. I don't think I've ever gotten that much out of that scripture before. I mean, you said it was layered, and it definitely was layered. And for me personally, I've had more naps in the past year than I wish to claim. But to think that maybe those naps have been spiritual for me
Yeah.
takes away the guilt of feeling like I'm not doing anything when I keep falling asleep all the time.
Yeah.
So it's nice to know that naps can be spiritual, as well as silence is spiritual.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. I'm so glad that it impacted you in that way. That's something that I strongly believe. I mean, if it's good for the body, it's good for the soul, right? So, yeah, anything that we can do to restore ourselves. And naps are good for the mind as well. There are things that we work out when we are asleep, there are things that we figure out when we are asleep. It puts our minds at ease. And there's a time for everything. So, times to be alert and times to give it a rest. Any others? All right.
Thank you. As somebody who works in the mental health field and also is in recovery for mental health, I just want to say I appreciate your message. And I just hope that more people can talk about it and for it to be destigmatized because there are a lot of people that are struggling with it. I know my cousin that recently passed away. He was homeless and he was mental had mental health issues and as well as addiction issues and was recently found dead. So um, that person on the subway basically is my cousin, you know. So it really hits home for me. And what I also appreciate is that because they just had his service last week, it was live streamed. I was able to watch it because all my family is in California, and my older brother did the eulogy, and he specifically talked about mental health, which is like the first time anybody in my family has ever openly talked about it. So I appreciate that, but I also appreciate your message as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. And your vulnerability in sharing, as this is very close to home and recent. Yeah, I think we need to talk about it in all ways. We need to talk about it in the pulpit. And even though the Bible doesn't lay out, all of these disorders that we now know, there certainly are many instances of deep distress that we can lift up as a way to normalize what people today experience, for sure. Yeah, Adrian?
Thank you so much. When you were getting to the end of your message, I realized that there was a lot you were saying that is not always the way that I deal with people that I need to, and that it will help me a lot. And so I appreciate that. The other thing that I thought of when you were speaking is that the other part of the mental health need here that we don't know is this guy who thought that he could choke somebody to death in front of all these people he didn't know and it would be okay. And then what makes it worse is initially the civics institutions did make it okay because I believe they released him originally, and it's only because of the protests that now I guess he's facing it. But I think there's a mental health problem there too. It's a different kind.
Yeah.
But I think that is also so on both sides, and we don't immediately think about that.
Right.
I think it's there.
Yeah,
Okay.
that is a good point. Yeah, there's crisis on both sides, and unmet needs across the board that cause people to lash out, to misunderstand, to react to situations that are unknown in really awful ways. And when we don't address mental health, those are some of the consequences. It can be really dangerous, for sure. Yeah. One more.
I think when we get to the point of like violence and stuff, a lot of it has to do with like mental health and guns. When we talked about gun violence and stuff, that comes from, the violence that we see every day. You know what I mean? So a lot of times it's the guns the mental health that's the problem, not, so much the guns itself, to me, so.
Well, it's certainly a mixture of things. We know that mental health is something that, makes people more vulnerable to be a victim than to perpetuate. But it's certainly a connection there.
But
that
we
needs to
don't talk about it. It's like something that's just like, when it comes to the gun violence, a lot of times it's because of that, you know what I mean? So.
It can be. It can be. It's certainly not in all cases, but it can be. Yeah.
I think it's become a little more prevalent than everybody was scared to death because of rights and civil liberties. Anytime you try, and I have personal experience with family members, anytime we were trying to do anything, and you couldn't unless he wanted it, and that's very hard to convince somebody with mental issues that they need to seek help. And so it was a catch-22. I mean, knew that needed drug rehabilitation, needed mental health, but unless they're willing to do it, you can't drag them off the street and put them in there. So society needs to look at that. And yes, there is times that need to intervene and be able to at least get those people at least 72 hours and get them at least dried out so that you can talk to them and to where, yeah, maybe they will seek some help if they, and just get them dried out
They can't
for
get guns, like they can't get their hands on a gun.
True.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues that are being raised, and yeah, I think that we need to continue having these conversations so that it's not strange or weird for people to seek help, because you're right. If somebody doesn't want the help, then there's not really much that you can do. They have to want the help, and to want the help comes with getting rid of some of the stigma. The idea that it's a weakness, the idea that you are, a bad person, or that you're crazy, or that you can't have faith and struggle. Like, all of those things we have to undo so that someone getting help doesn't feel so scary and so wrong. Um, and certainly there can be a link between mental illness and violence, but it is not direct. It is more likely that someone who is really disturbed is going to be a danger either to themselves or, yeah, mostly to themselves or to be a victim of violence.
Hi, I wanted to bounce off of what you said and say that I think a lot of the reason why people do decline like help when it's offered is because so much of what is currently offered within our society is kind of like a one size fits all band-aid to really nuanced, complex issues. And I appreciate that we have a mental health care system. I just am also aware that our society as it is right now is a little bit flawed because someone could be having mental health struggles due to an abusive environment at home that they're experiencing trauma in, but there's not a safe way to get out if it's compounded for them where it's now made it difficult to work to afford to move out, and there's not really a secondary option like on top of that for them. And I also there just isn't much like acute like rapid healthcare when it comes to mental health. And I know, unfortunately, in Delaware specifically, I had a girlfriend when I was about 15 who went to one of the inpatient programs here, and it ended up, because it wasn't the right fit for her, caused her to actually come out with more trauma and issues than she'd gone in with, unfortunately. And
Yeah.
I think until we can get like some of the wider systemic issues addressed, like it makes sense that people will struggle to like get their immediate help, which is so sad. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like there needs more of that. There needs to be more of it than just celebrities talking about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Addiction or as alcohol, drugs, or and mental issues is the you try to seek help when they go taking the psychiatrist. Oh well, you got drugs and alcohol. You got to get that straightened out before you can come back and see me. So they throw them out, and it's like hitting stone walls every time you go to somebody drug counselor. Well, he needs to see a psychiatrist, and it was very frustrating 3 years. Now he's in prison. So that's how he ended up.
Yeah,
And
we need a
no
lot
help.
of we need a lot of support. Yeah,
That's the help we got.
right. We need our systems to change, and I also worked in a psychiatric facility for some time as well, and that's also a very corrupted place. It reflects our wider societal issues, and it's hard. It can feel overwhelming to think about all that needs to change, but I have to believe that at least a part of it starts with these conversations. How do we actually treat people with dignity and care? How do we actually help people unlearn what we've been taught? Misconceptions, our own fears, our own responses to people who need care, people we see on the subway, people we know in our life. How do we respond differently so that that can't happen?
I think also just like you were saying, like music, things like that can help the soul. Like that's the stuff that can get us through. Like love, like religion, spirituality, that type of stuff
Yeah.
is what can get people through.
Yeah, it's so many things.
So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I'm glad you brought that up about music because there is success stories because my granddaughter Jessica was having mental issues for a long time as a young teenager, and growing up she was in Rockford. She went to another place in Maryland, which really helped her. That place, Rockford, and some of the other places did nothing for her. It caused her more trauma, like you were talking about. But she has since gone on and graduated from college. She's doing art therapy, which is and dealing
Art, yeah.
and dealing. She's a teacher in Philadelphia at a charter school that deals with kids 16 to 19 who haven't been able to graduate because of all their issues that they have. And she's now in a master's program for her art therapy. So people are talking about it. Families do respond, and there is help. It's just that it's more. But I think families need help. Parents need help when they have teenagers and young people.
Yeah.
And if more other parents could be helpful instead of criticizing and being judgmental about children with mental illnesses. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to tell you that God is good.
Yes. Thank you for that reminder that we always need. Thank you for that hope. And there are stories. We can live with these things. They're not death sentences. They can be lived with. They can be worked through. We can heal. People can go on to be successful, however success looks for them. And these things are happening every day as well. And so how do we link people to those stories in the right ways, even if it's individual? But yes, thank you for reminding us of God's power, because it is happening and it is still here. Anyone else? Does anyone on Zoom have anything that they would like to add?
So Jasmine, Lulu, and Odin, I'm not sure which of them, but I'd assume it's not Odin, said,
It could be.
I recently seen this and it spoke to me so much. I just wanted to share. And then in quotes, "You're going to be fine. You always are," end quotes. Yes, I will be, but please allow me a moment to express and display my sadness and discomfort. I know it will get better, but I need to also be honest and say my spirit is temporarily heavy and not have to hide that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that quote. That's a beautiful quote. I think I've seen it. But yeah, people know they'll be okay and may just need a moment, right? It's okay to take a moment. And a moment could be a month, it could be a year, but it's okay. To be taken care of and to be safe is what is important. Awesome. Well, thank you for that, Jasmine and Lulu and Odin, for sharing. Thank you for this lively discussion. This was really beautiful. Yeah. Well, we are grateful for Elijah. I think a lot of times we think of him as a victor, and he certainly was, but he also offers us something deeper as well. He lets us know that we are not alone, and we don't have to be the most dramatic examples of a mental health crisis to have one. It can ebb and flow. It can be because we're experiencing grief. And so just to know that we're not alone. And so I appreciate all of you and your vulnerability in this conversation.